So Kayla, I think I'm seeing the older version of this, but I'll go ahead and kick it off. So we have quite a few panelists today, including Mike Andrews, who is one of our subcontracts with our enterprise community partners friends. He has quite a bit of development experience. He was the director of development at Home Forge, formerly known as Portland Housing Authority. He's also runs his own consulting firm doing some of this great development work that we're going to be talking about today. He's one of our TA providers. If you worked on a RAD project, you may have had him as a launch TA provider. And he also, excuse me, he also delivered HUD's Intro to Repositioning sessions that you may have joined last year. Kayla, it looked like the slide went away, but I can keep going.
Yeah, I was just going to pull up the agenda version. Hold on.
Sure, no problem. And in addition, we have Kathleen Foster, who's been in the affordable housing world for 30 years, working on many programs, including RAD, mixed finance development, LIHTC syndication, Hope 6, Choice Neighborhoods, and she also spent some time as the Vice President of Real Estate for the Charlotte Housing Authority, where they developed or acquired roughly 3,000 affordable housing units during her tenure, and she currently runs her own affordable housing consulting firm as well. So with that, we also have some HUD staff on the phone or on the line in advance. This is myself. I'm from the Office of Public and Indian Housing. You've heard me before if you've been on one of these sessions. Lucy Blackburn, who's the Director of Choice Neighborhoods. Greg Byrne needs no introduction. Today is his last day as the Transaction Division Manager for the Office of Recap. Jane Hornstein and Kathy Shebus, both from the Special Applications Center. So we have a wide variety of backgrounds. And just for the purpose of this presentation, Mike and Kathleen are going to be speaking to you from the perspective of their former positions as Housing Authority Development Directors. So rather than their private developer role that they're in now, or private developer consultant role they're in now, they're going to be speaking from that previous PHA perspective. And so why are we here? So, you know, we are going to talk about 7 or 8 of the most important topics that come up when a housing authority who's engaging in a repositioning action needs to think about when they're potentially working with the developer. So, you know, HUD has experience in the rulemaking and the processing, but this is really going to be discussing the strategic decision-making process for working with the developer. Next slide. Okay, and so just as a background for everybody, we're going to do this in a bit of a round table fashion. So instead of going through a PowerPoint slide by slide, I'm going to ask these questions from the perspective of, say, a board member or an executive director at a housing authority, and Mike and Kathleen are going to be giving the responses, like I said, from their perspective as a development director at a housing authority. We'll also have the HUD staff chime in with any additional insights that they might have. So please forgive us, you know, we're technologically limited here. We can't replicate what it would be like in person, but imagine we're doing a roundtable here. And in addition, we're going to have these slides available as well as a more robust slide deck following the when this presentation goes onto the HUD Exchange. And then in addition, as Kayla mentioned, this was one of the topics that came up from one of the survey responses where folks wanted to hear about working with the developer. So we really do take those into account. And so with no further ado, let me start with our first question. So imagine I'm the executive director of a public housing authority and we plan to convert one of our properties to Section 8 via repositioning. When does a transaction typically require a developer? And what is the role of it? Mike?
Okay, so Dan, I'm going to start with this one in our roundtable. And let me just say that for a basic repositioning, something like a RAD streamline conversion, a streamlined voluntary conversion, or just a Section 18 demo dispo, you really don't need a developer. So if you're not doing any rehab, you certainly don't need to hire a developer. It's something that you can do. You may want to hire a development consultant, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later, but you certainly don't need a full-blown developer to be able to manage a conversion where there's really no rehab. And even if it's a conversion that just has a minor rehab, say maybe 15,000 a unit, probably your mod department has handled similar rehabs many times, and again, you likely don't need to hire a third-party developer in that context. But as you move towards substantial rehab and may need to use 4% tax credits, or you move towards new construction and you might want to use 9% LIHTC, an experienced developer will be required, I'm going to say that again, required by your housing finance agency. It'll be required one of two ways. Either it'll be required as a threshold qualification, or the points assigned to the experience of the developer will be so large as to effectively eliminate you from the competition if you're not an experienced developer. So just be prepared that if you want to do a LIHTC deal and you've never done one before, you will need to have a partner on that first walk down the LIHTC road. And then, Mike, you want to talk more about the role of the developer?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. So if you're the director at a housing authority or at a housing authority and you're considering repositioning, you're considering whether or not you should be the developer or hire a developer, understanding the role of the developer is pretty important. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the role of the developer. At a high level, the developer is responsible for everything necessary to carry out the successful repositioning of your project. So in this training, we're really talking about repositioning of existing public housing, so we'll keep everything in that context. So the developer is responsible for everything, from the idea and the germination of that idea through the successful operation of the building once it's on the Section 8 platform following the conversion and any rehab, and everything in between. So the next slide we put together illustrates a little bit of, breaks down those tasks. So Kayla, if you could flip to our next slide.
You should see it now, Mike.
Yeah, I must have a delay, and I'm sorry. I'm looking at the WebEx screen, and I still see the prior question slide, but that's fine. So the development process shows the kind of the fundamentals of the development activities that are necessary, organized into these 6 headings. And so it's a bit of a snapshot of all the activities, organized in a way that generally resembles the sequence of activities. If you're considering repositioning, and if you're considering being the developer, it's really important to make sure that you spend enough time on the strategic planning step. And this has come up in other trainings that you may have participated in. The strategic planning step is really where you figure out what it is you want to do with your asset, what it is you want to accomplish. How do you want to go about serving low-income people with your real estate? Making decisions like, do I want to keep this building? Do I want to sell this building? Does this building need a substantial rehab, or can it get by with something that's lighter? Just fundamental strategic decisions are really important and are necessary to make early in that process. Largely those are done by the housing authority, but the housing authority could also use some outside help, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Resident engagement is generally a next step, and resident engagement is a broad category here that can begin with thinking about how you're going to approach residents and talk to them about what could be a rather disruptive activity in their life, all the way through the mechanics of signing new lease documents with them once the conversion is complete, and everything in between. This would include writing notices, organizing and conducting the necessary resident meetings, delivering information to residents that's necessary for them to understand what's going to happen in the building that they live in. It might be that it's a really low-impact relocation activity where they stay in place and all that's really happening is their subsidies changing, and the relocation event is the subsidy change. It might be that they actually have to permanently leave that building. So this could also include then the physical move and organizing that move. It might mean that they're shuffling around inside of the building, and to allow for the construction to flow through the building in the way that you've planned. And so actually executing the move of residents through the building during the construction duration are all things that go into resident engagement. Pre-development activities is a large category here. It's largely anchored by the design process, so figuring out what is the work that will be done in the building. Related to that would be managing the permit process, the entitlement process. That would include hiring other consultants necessary to help with pre-development activities. Typical other consultants would be your geotech, survey. Often mostly the geotech and survey work for the owner. Most of the time, engineers will work for your architect. Typical engineers that are needed on a project would include structural, civil, and sometimes mechanical, depending upon what you're doing with the heating and cooling systems in your building. So there's a number of other consultants to hire. Managing the permit process, so engaging with your city to make sure that you understand what's necessary to get a permit to start the process. Engaging with title, so you get a preliminary title report early, making sure that you understand if there's any easements. With the repositioning, this is an important early step to make sure that the proper HUD, DOT has been recorded against the property so that you can then have that released at the conversion event. So there's a large bundle of activities that relate to pre-development. I'd also put into this category your environmental review. So either your Part 58 or your Part 50, depending upon what type of conversion tool you're using. There's a lot of steps that go into that pre-development activity. Two things to flag there to look out for that are the most often trip hazard in the environmental reviews are the requirements, if there are any. So if your building is old enough or if it's been historically designated, your historic preservation review is important to get ahead of. And then looking to see if there's any flood zone issues with your property. Lines can change over time. And so if you've got an older building that started out in an area that was not in a designated area, a flood area, but just over time it may find itself in one. So identifying that early and flagging that early are important. So those are all pre-development activities that are necessary to be carried out. Could be by your developer, could be by the housing authority. The next area is paying for it, so the affordable housing finance. And if you're doing a no debt conversion where you don't have a lot of rehab needs, there might not be a lot of activity here. It might just be spending some of your own capital on the cost related to the conversion event. Maybe it's spending a little bit of your own capital on some minor or modest rehab. That continuum then goes up as you have more construction need. And so maybe you're doing a debt only. Maybe you're doing debt with low-income housing tax credits. Maybe you're seeking other subsidies that are available from your city or your county or your state. Those are all activities that are organized and carried out by the developer. Once you've assembled all the money and everyone's agreed to share that money with you, you have a closing, and that is the typical start of construction. The construction management activity is an important step in the development process, typically carried out by the developer. Prior to the start of construction, there's the pre-construction activities. This is often carried out along with the design process, and it's where a lot of problem solving or other value engineering activities go into making sure that you can fit your scope of work in your budget. Understanding how the work will flow through the building so you understand how it might impact the residents living in the building and what that means for your necessary relocation plan, what it means for how residents will move throughout the building. Once you start construction, there's a nearly day-to-day, if not week-to-week, responsibility of managing the general contractor. And a lot of change management, a lot of problem solving going into what is discovered through the course of construction. Typically, the developer is responsible for that, and making decisions, authorizing changes, pushing back on the contractor when necessary to say that, you might want to say to them, hey, we don't think that that's a real change. You might think that that's something that the contractor should have foreseen. You might think that that's something that it's their responsibility, not the owner's responsibility. Having negotiated a really solid contract with the contractor is important. Making sure that your schedule of values, your scope of work, any exceptions in the construction contract, that would be the place that the contractor could say, hey, this is an exception, this wasn't in our base money or our base contract amount, this is something new, this is truly an unforeseen condition. Getting a really solid, tight construction contract so that the owner is protected and that the work completed can be done smoothly. All of those steps have a regulatory thread that runs through them. So the regulatory thread is shown as the last category, but in reality, it touches everything. If you've done these before, you know that there's a lot of rules related to relocation. And depending upon which repositioning tool you use, there's different rules that apply. You then go through your Part 50 or Part 58. You then go through any entitlements or any other permitting activities. Lots of rules related to affordable housing finance, depending upon which financing tools you're using. And then ultimately the conversion, the placement in service or the starting of operations itself. All of those regulatory rules are things that the developer needs to be aware of. They need to know what those rules are. They need to know who the regulator is and how to engage with that regulator. That regulator is HUD. HUD is one of them. It could be your state. It could be your city. Whomever gives you a development subsidy is a level of a regulator. It also likely involves your state prevailing wage office. So understanding what those rules are and making sure that you've got the right prevailing wage determination established for your project so that you don't have any trouble with being called out for not having the right prevailing wages cooked into your GMP and your construction contract. All of that is the development process. So when we continue to talk about who does what or what those risks are and how you engage a developer, it's important to establish this basic understanding of what are the things that go into the development process. From I've got an idea that I might want to reposition my building, continuing through all these steps until you end with you've successfully completed the rehabilitation, you've signed new leases with all of your residents, and now the subsidy on the Section 8 platform is now flowing to the new owner of this building, which could be an incarnation of the Housing Authority, and you've successfully repositioned. Everything from the idea to the new subsidy flowing is the responsibility of the development, within the development process. Many of those steps that you look to the developer to do.
And hey, Mike, Greg, and Kathleen. So a good part of the remaining portion of this presentation is going to be, so if those are the collective roles of what a development entity does, it's really, Kathleen that says, hey, the more complicated deal, particularly when you go towards tax credits, the more likely the HFA is going to say, I want someone who's got experience, right? So and if you don't have experience with PHA, you're going to need to bring in a partner. Then the question is, which of these roles will a PHA assume? Does it turn it all over to a developer? Does it keep some of those tasks in-house? And who's taking the risk? And so just to frame that a bit, to say now that we've got a sense of the big picture of what are the collective set of tasks that are in development, then it's a question of where do I as a PHA fit in that, and when do I have to sort of turn it all over versus when can I do some of that? So I think that's what's going to sort of show up in the next couple of slides.
And I would just add a short thing, which is that there was a reason for us to develop this slide and for Mike to walk you through every single step of it, which is the real question for you as a PHA is, do I have the capacity to take on all these tasks? And to put it in the simplest, most blunt form, if you don't have the capacity, you're not going to have a successful development. And if it's a tax credit development, you don't really even have an option because the HFA will require it. So you do want to get a partner in that situation. And if, like Greensboro and some of the other housing authorities that I've worked with, you eventually want to build capacity to be your own developer, you want to say that in your RFQ in selecting a developer partner, that you want to pick somebody who will help you build capacity. And in most cases, you probably want to keep control of the property management function, since that's something you're probably already doing. Again, you may need assistance if you're working in a program like LIHTC that has a lot of rules, but in terms of basic property management, that's one thing you may want to continue and do on your own while working with a developer partner on the other aspects of the development.
So Kathleen and everyone, this is Lucy. Just to add another thought onto that, that even if you do, if the PHA does hire a developer who will be responsible for all or most some aspects of the project, the PHA still really needs to be heavily involved in what's going on with the project, in monitoring the developer, making sure the developer is moving forward as they're supposed to, because we all know if something goes wrong, the PHA is going to be front and center. So you know, even with an experienced developer, be sure the PHA is always part of the discussions and part of the conversation on what's going on with your project.
Before we get into this next question, Dan, let me touch on one of the points that Greg made as a way to expand on that prior development process slide a bit. Maybe, Kayla, you could slide back one, and to set up some of the next conversation. The developer doesn't have to do all of these things. And in my experience, having been at a housing authority, running a development department, where I did a lot of joint venture projects, and I did a lot of self-development projects. The joint venture projects were had some consistencies, but could be very situational. So I know, you know, Kathleen's experience was a bit different, where they had a program and they set up their program and they tried to carry that out and have all their deals look very similar. A lot of the joint ventures that I had done were, maybe because they were opportunistic or opportunity driven, were very different. So my point here is that your relationship with the developer doesn't have to always be the same. You might want to say that you want the developer to do everything. You might turn over nearly all of the activities on the slide to your developer. You might say to the developer, you know what, the things that are important to us are the resident engagement, and we really know this thing. We really know maybe there's in-house capacity around affordable housing finance, and that's something you're going to keep in-house, but you need a developer partner to do the rest of it. So understanding your internal capacity in that moment in time when you're looking to take on this transaction should be a determinant of how you engage with a developer and how you parse these activities. And so laying out what the comprehensive soup to nuts activities are, and then saying that you don't have to do them all, and you don't have to turn them all over to a partner. There can be combinations of what are engaged with the developer to perform.
Thanks, Joel. And I think on to the next question, you all sort of spoke to this issue a little bit, but I'll ask it more directly. So, you know, now that we know all the functions the developer might do, and when one is needed, when should I expect to be able to self-develop, i.e. the housing authority serves as their own developer, and on what project should I seek a development partner?
Yeah, so I'll take this one first, Dan. So I guess the blunt first way to think about it is, do you have capacity? If you don't have the capacity to be the developer, then you should engage with a developer partner. The tasks necessary, the risks, and the underwriting thresholds that you need to get through are such that if you don't have the capacity, you need to find a partner to help you with that. Now that said, if you don't have the capacity, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't that you should be dissuaded from trying to build that capacity. So it might be that you have made a decision as an organization that you want to build the capacity to be a developer. And if you've done that, a couple of points to think about or to leave you with are that that is a big decision. A housing authority becoming its own developer is not a one-off project-specific decision. It's an organizational commitment that your organization needs to make. I'd suggest to you that your board needs to be heavily on board with that commitment, your director, your leadership, because it takes the organization to be a successful housing authority developer. There's risks that you're going to take on. There's implications on staffing, on the number of decisions that your board is going to be asked to make, on what your internal accounting structure needs to be responsible for, and on down the list. So it is an organizational decision that you need to seriously consider and not think about it as a one-off project decision. If you've made that decision that you want to be the developer and you don't yet have the capacity, the way in which you engage with a developer partner can help you build that capacity. And so going back to thinking about that list we shown earlier, you might engage with your developer partner and say, and just have it on the table. You want to build capacity. You want to learn from them. You want to take certain things on so that on this deal, your developer partner, your first deal, they might do a lot of the heavy lifting, but you and your staff are there learning. And then on the next deal, you can do more. And then on your third deal, you can do even more. So that over time, you'll be able to then show to whomever is going to ask you what your capacity is, that you've got a track record of deals that you've progressively participated in and done certain things successfully, and you now have that success to show for yourself. So if you don't have the capacity now, you need a developer partner. If you want to build the capacity, make that part of the conversation with your developer partner so that it becomes part of the way you engage with them. Now, Kathleen, you had some experience in Charlotte. Maybe you want to talk a bit about how you engaged with developers.
Right. So we were in a very unusual situation in that we've been lucky enough to get a number of HOPE6 awards, and we had leveraged those so that we had HOPE6 funds, excess HOPE6 funds that needed to be spent within a very short time frame. And we had a new housing trust fund, so that's a local resource that you'll want to check into. And we had two very experienced developers already in the community with a really strong track record of getting tax credits year after year after year. So one was a nonprofit, one was a for-profit developer. So rather than compete with them, we decided the best strategy for getting the money out and the units built as quickly as possible was to partner with them. And that turned into, a really good strategy in terms of just the volume of production that we were able to generate. And after doing, 10 deals with the two of them, we were really in a position to move into self-development on specific projects when we wanted to. And I think Lucy's got some examples too, Milwaukee and Tulsa, where they made different decisions about self-developing or partnering.
Right. In Milwaukee, and I worked with them similar to working with Kathleen for many years. Milwaukee had a very large portfolio of big public housing projects and made the decision early on that they were going to self-develop, and they did self-develop. 5 or 6 HOPE6 grants, all their mixed finance projects. So as was mentioned, they made this decision early on. It wasn't going to be a one-time thing. It was a number of projects that they were going to move forward with. And they made the connections over the years with the local consultants, particularly with this Wisconsin Housing Finance Agency, and they were also part of the city in that case. So they had good relationships with the city that they would need for development. And so they started relying somewhat, I'm sure, on consultants, but over the years they had that capacity to implement all the large multi-phase projects on their own. They had key staff, financing staff, they had construction staff, and it was worth the investment to them. On the other hand, Tulsa, who I'm now working with on their Choice Neighborhoods project, in the past, they were not interested in development. They maybe had a mod department, but they had a Hope 6 project. They used a developer. But they brought in a new executive director, and that executive director had experience and saw the potential for the agency to move forward with self-development. So after discussions again with the board, as was pointed out, they saw that as their future direction, and they started to move slowly to build up their capacity. I believe I was told that in 3 years they went from 1 person in their development office to 15. So they geared up. They partnered with the developer for choice neighborhoods, but they're in every aspect of it. They're co-developers, they're learning, they have responsibilities, and so now they're starting to do more self-development on their other projects, and probably moving to the point where in the future they will be self-developing. So they took time to move to that, and then they see that as a role for themselves in the future.
Hey, Lucy, I want to add to that. This is Greg again. One of the PHAs you've worked with, name won't be mentioned, but one of their first deals that they did, this is now back 15 or 18 years ago with Hope 6, that they didn't do tax credits. They didn't really leverage the tax credit. And the PHA, so they did development on their own, and the PHA today is really thinking of restarting that whole deal, like revisiting it, possibly tearing down the property and all that. And that was a function of the PHA really did miss out by not bringing in sufficient development, external expertise to come in, because at the time someone might have said, is this really the right choice to rehab this property? Or should we think now about tearing it down and building anew? So that's one of the risks that a PHA does sometimes if they go off on there and it's new, particularly if the first time they've never done development before, is it makes sense to sort of get in some expertise if you haven't done this about whether you're going on the right path. And again, we'll talk more about that in the presentation, whether that's by getting that expertise from a developer or separately hiring a development consultant to work alongside you. But if you haven't done development before, getting appropriate sort of a skill set and experience is huge.
Yeah, absolutely critical, especially if you do have tax credits. You just can't afford to make a mistake.
Yeah, in addition to just you're not making a mistake, in many states, there's a threshold criteria that you need to demonstrate that your team has capacity, and states will define what their capacity threshold is differently, but you need to show that you've got experience and capacity to be eligible for the credits. In other states, it becomes one of the competitive criteria. And so having a developer partner can help your cause if you need credits and your housing authority doesn't have that experience. A couple of other considerations that we wanted to leave folks with in thinking about it. So we talked a lot about capacity, and that's like a baseline, fundamental question to ask yourself. Some other things to ask yourself about, like when should you use a developer? Go back to what Kathleen had started with about the type of transaction that it might be. So the size and complexity is one of the considerations. And so if you're doing a no debt, no rehab conversion, you likely don't need a developer, but you will be doing some of the repositioning developer tasks. And so that, in a way, that helps build your experience. And you don't necessarily need a developer to do that. It also might be what moment in time are you looking to take this transaction on. When I ran a development department at a housing authority, we had internal capacity and we had the ability to take on and complete large, successful, complicated projects. We also used developer partners a lot. And we did that sometimes because of timing and bandwidth. It might have been that we were fully occupied with other work and we really wanted to move this other project forward in this moment in time. It might have been because there was a pot of money that was only going to be available for another year, year and a half, and we didn't want to lose that opportunity. It might have been that this opportunity landed in our lap and we didn't want to say no. But in order to say yes, we needed to augment our capacity. So some of it has to do with the moment in time that the development opportunity comes along and whether you've got the bandwidth. Another thing to think about is what I call the mission importance, or how critical is the project, or how critical are some of those steps. So going back to the development process, there are certain things that a housing authority might not want to turn over to the developer partner because they are so mission critical, or they're very sensitive in your community. There's going to be lots of stakeholders watching, and watching with a sort of keen advocate eye, and that you don't want to turn that over to someone else, but you want to keep that in-house and control it more. So those are some other considerations to think about when you're deciding whether you'll take on a project, or what piece of a project do you want to keep for yourself because of your own internal decisions.
Thanks, Mike. And I think Greg kind of teed us up for our next question, which is, he used the term, what is a developer consultant, and how does it relate to what a developer does?
Okay, so a developer consultant typically is not going to take the risks or provide guarantees that a full-on developer would do. Rather, you want to think of this person or this entity as people with a specific expertise that can help you get through a specific process. So we talked about earlier that one of the first decisions the PHA has to make is what properties they want to keep and rehab, which they want to demo and build new, and which they just want to dispose of and sell to another party. And if you don't have experience in evaluating, real estate developments, it can be really helpful to bring in a consultant to help you make that decision. Because then once you have made the decision, then you can really do a better job of selecting the developer for a specific project. You, as a PHA, really want to take the leadership role in developing your overall strategy, and a development consultant can help you do that. So a couple of situations where I would consider a development consultant would be if you're a smaller PHA, say you have an executive director and 1 or 2 additional staff, you probably do not have the bandwidth to be able even really to easily get through just a straight up repositioning conversion. And so you may want to use a developer consultant in that context. Or if you're a larger PHA and you have a lot of properties, all of which you need a strategy for, you may want to use a developer consultant to help you decide what's the appropriate strategy for each property and what's the right timing, which project should go first, second, third, so that you really come up with a strategy that can be directly implemented. And then Mike's going to talk a little bit about what development consultant resources are available, and then how you would go about what are the rules for selecting a developer consultant.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. So if you're thinking about a development consultant, it's likely because you've got a question that you need answered or a problem that you need to solve. And so defining what that is and defining kind of the scope or the breadth of that question or that problem is an important place to start. If it's not a large or huge question or a huge problem, you could start by talking to your HUD field office and inquiring about some of the technical assistance which they have available to help housing authorities with some of these repositioning questions. And so if it's a smaller, finite question that you need help with, that's a great place to start. It's a pretty efficient way and quick way for you to get some expertise to keep you moving. If your question or problem is bigger than that, bigger than what the PA resources from HUD can provide for, then you likely want to hire a development consultant. And you can do that through an RFP or an RFQ process, and it can bring them on and have them on board to address a larger scope. Typically, this is done early. Typically, this is done early in the process where you're figuring out some of the strategy questions, where you're trying to decide what to do with your portfolio or what to do with a project within your portfolio. And it helps you lay out what that whole plan looks like that gets you to your desired end result. So development consultants can be great on the front end. They can also assist you along the way, and so as Kathleen had said, typically a development consultant, unlike a developer, won't take on some of the risks that a developer will take on. They also don't, so there's a risk-reward dynamic that we'll talk about in a little bit. But a development consultant can certainly help you with tasks, so they can, I often talk about it as helping you with their head and their hands. So they'll help you think through things, or they'll help you produce things. They often don't help with the financial underwriting that is necessary by bringing a balance sheet or signing guarantees. Developer partner typically does that.
So I might add also that there are local consultants that can help with aspects of your development, and then there seems to be a group of national consultants who have expertise in RAD or mixed finance or other types of HUD programs that can help you, but may not know your local situation as well. So you might need to think about, what do I really need help with, and what type of consultant, and what is their experience? How is that important to what I need?
And I would just chime in here, I would say that in my experience, I would not recommend using an architectural firm as your development consultant. It's so tempting to draw beautiful designs that you really can't afford. So, or that, you know, everyone gets committed to, including residents, and then we find they're far outside of the budget. So it is important to do master planning on very large projects that are going to be multiply phased. But please be sure that someone with the financial background is kind of acting as a restraint on you know, plans that could get out of hand and become unaffordable. And then people usually have questions about, well, what do developer consultants cost? And so they may charge an hourly fee, and you can compare that to your, you know, call your peers in the industry and see how that fee compares with what they've paid for developer consultants. Or they may define a scope of work and have, you know, a flat fee related to that scope of work, or a flat fee with a cap. And there are some consultants, particularly if you've hired them to help you put together a particular project, who are willing to wait until the closing to be paid. So, you know, it's pretty much up for your negotiation, and it will, you will benefit from talking to your peers about what their relationship with the consultant costs, and be sure to check references as always.
You know, a couple of other points to add on to that. Going back to the capacity discussion earlier, and housing authorities that are interested in growing their capacity. I have seen and been involved in projects where the housing authority will have a consultant working for the housing authority, working for the owner, and there's a developer involved. And sometimes housing authorities want this approach because they feel like they might not know what they don't know, or they might not know what questions to ask. And so they want someone who's looking out for their interest, engaging with them in conversations with the developer. So this can be a way to make sure that the housing authority's interests are well tended to, and a way to grow the capacity of the housing authority. So there's a way to transfer skills and knowledge in that while working on a project to staff internally at the housing authority, so that they build that knowledge and that ability to take on some of these responsibilities themselves. So a development consultant can also be involved when there is a developer. Now, those projects are typically large enough that the project budget can support that, but it is definitely a way to kind of cover risks and cover any gaps that might exist in bandwidth or knowledge or capacity with the housing authority. Related to that, the other point to leave you with here is that even if you've hired a developer, it's important for the housing authority to stay engaged. And we'll talk about risks here in a little bit, but it's really important to pay attention to the project, even if it's things that you've hired the developer to do, and it's the developer's responsibility. It's likely that your housing authority will always be associated with that project in your community. So everyone's going to know it is your project. If If something goes sideways, it's your housing authority that's going to get the phone call. So knowing enough about how the project is going is really important. And then knowing enough about how the internal schedule, budget, cost, program decisions are going is also important, so that you're not surprised, so that you're aware of things as they are occurring in real time. So even if you hire a developer, you should always think about staying engaged. You never want to be in a place where if something does go sideways on a project, you don't want to have to answer questions like, why didn't you know about that? Or how did this happen? You want to be able to try to identify things early enough that you can say, hey, we're on it. We know what's happening and we're managing that change. Stuff comes up on projects all the time. And just being able to engage in that change management in real time is super important. So stay engaged with your developer, whether it's with a development consultant or yourself directly, so that you're not surprised after the fact.
Hey, I just want to jump in here. We had a couple of questions from the audience, and I think I can address one, but I'll lean on Jane and Greg and Lucy for a little help with them. But the first was, does HUD have a list of developer consultant PHAs? And for that, it's not really HUD practice to recommend any outside consultants. I think in that case, I would recommend, if a housing authority doesn't have any pre-existing relationships, I would speak with their local NARO partners or their PHAs in their locality or abroad or nationally to find out who they've worked with and what experiences they've had. And then, does HUD have a template for an RFP or RFQ to solicit a developer consultant? Greg, I think I've seen one of those on the RAD side for potentially, but Jane, Greg, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think we've ever produced a sample RFP. We've been asked that a number of times. We've been free to circulate RFPs that various PHAs have put together that we thought were pretty damn solid. So I don't think we ever went so far as to say this is a suggested one. It's something that HUD can continue to look at. But without doubt, one of the best things to do is to talk to your other PHAs in the state who are doing development stuff and see if they can share with you what they're using.
Yeah, and if you're truly, go ahead, Jane.
Oh, sorry, Dan. I'd like to recommend too that you look at. I know in the state of Illinois and probably in other states too, the State Housing Finance Agency probably posts information about deals they've done. And you can look at those as well to see who's really active in the low-income housing tax credit market. And my guess is if you Google, you could probably find lots of RFPs that are currently out there. I don't know if they'll be good or bad, but it would be one way to look for them. So.
And if you're really stymied, feel free to email repositioning@hud.gov, and we can help you directly. So just in the interest of time here, let's move on to the next question, which is, so if I take on a development partner, how should I think about sharing the risks and rewards? And Mike touched upon the risk and rewards earlier in the presentation, but this is an opportunity to kind of dive deeper into that. Mike?
Yeah, let's flesh that out a little bit. So a real estate project, a repositioning project, will come with risks. It also comes with benefits and rewards, but there's definitely risks to be aware of and understand what they are, what the exposure is, and how to mitigate them. And so we listed on this slide some of the key risks to think about. Not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the big ones. These are things to keep in mind when you're thinking about either self-developing, because if you self-develop, you would be responsible for all of these things. Or if you engage a partner, then the conversation becomes how you're going to parse this risk between your partner and yourself. And there's kind of a logic to thinking about some of these that has to do with whose roles and responsibilities, and it also has a nexus with what the benefits are. So for example, The first one listed here is construction completion. So this risk is basically the obligation of the developer or the owner to deliver the project that was planned, notwithstanding the amount of money that was in your budget. So if you have cost overruns, you still have to deliver the project. And there's ways to mitigate that. So you can mitigate that with contingencies. You can mitigate that by having a quality general contractor that you know has the proven track record on delivering projects of this type. So there's definitely ways that you can mitigate that risk. But in the event that you burn through all those mitigations, at the end of the day, it will be someone's responsibility to complete that project, notwithstanding the overall sources of funding that you originally had. So that's construction completion. If you ask your developer to be responsible for construction management and for designing and constructing or rehabbing your project, they should take this risk. Whomever has that role, whoever has that responsibility should bear that risk. You should never find yourself in a situation as a housing authority where you're being asked to take on a risk which you don't have the responsibility or the duty to perform. So you wouldn't want to, as a housing authority, say to your developer partner, you manage design and construction, you get a developer fee for that portion of the project, and I'll share that risk with you. That wouldn't be a good deal for the housing authority. Conversely, if your developer is just going to be kind of a turnkey developer, and they're responsible for helping you get all the way through your C of O, helping you get your rehab completed and done, but they're not going to be in the ownership entity moving forward, and they're not going to have any responsibility for operations, they likely wouldn't want, and you likely wouldn't want to ask them to take on any operating deficit risk. So if they're not involved in managing the property, if they're not involved in leasing and collecting rent and containing operating expenses, then they shouldn't have the responsibility for the operating deficit. That should be the entity who has the responsibility of the day-to-day management. So there's this nexus or this relationship between the risks that are inherent in any repositioning real estate project, who does the work, and who gets the benefit. And the benefit is largely going to be cash benefit. But as a housing authority, there's other benefits as well that have to do with mission that I always keep in mind, about who's being served and things of that nature. But it largely you quantify the benefit with dollars. And so there's this relationship between risk and rewards. So this is important to keep in mind and keep these in mind early. And so when you're negotiating when you're thinking about an RFP, that's the time to start thinking about, well, what risks are we as a housing authority interested in and able to take on ourselves, and what are we wanting to ask our developer to be responsible for? So that's the time to think about your appetite or your willingness to bear some of these risks, and that becomes part of your conversation in seeking and selecting, and then signing up under contract a developer partner. A couple other of these, maybe just touch on them real quick. Some of the other risks here, the tax credit delivery. This has to do with lease up of your property or releasing your property, making sure that you deliver the credits that are expected by your developer, by your investor. Your construction loan guarantee. So your lender is going to look to have someone with sufficient net worth and liquidity sign up for these loan documents. And so as a housing authority, you may not have that cash. As a housing authority, you're always thinking about, where's my restricted money, what's my Section 9 money, what's my Section 8 money, what is my money that's not touched by HUD rules, and what's your liquidity, your cash on hand, what's your net worth, what are your contingent liabilities. Those are the types of things that an investor and lender are going to ask, and if you don't have that financial bandwidth, a developer can often bring that. And then repurchase obligation is kind of a cliff event for an equity investor, that if a developer doesn't or owner doesn't do certain things that are expected or required of the investor, a repurchase obligation is kind of like what it sounds, that you're repurchasing from your investor all of those credits for what money they had previously given you. That's a pretty big cliff event, and there's often attention paid to that to make sure you stay away from that cliff.
Thanks, Mike. I'll move on, which is a little bit kind of a visual representation of what we were just talking about.
Yeah, and so this just lays out those dynamics between the housing authority and the developer. And it goes back to this delineation of roles we had talked about. So what are all of the services or the activities necessary to carry out a project? And we talked about that during the development process slide. And what is the housing authority going to do? What's the developer going to do? What is there some overlap on? And then, where do each of those entities land on this risk continuum? Where do they land on the benefit continuum? So there's a relationship between the roles, the rewards, the risks, and how those things all come together on a project. Understanding that in the context of the transaction in front of you is very important.
Okay, and this goes kind of to the question from the audience, but are there HUD rules for selecting a developer?
Well, if you're selecting a developer and you're using federal funds as part of your redevelopment, if you were doing mixed finance or using your capital funds prior to a RAD conversion, yes, you would have to follow the federal procurement requirements in 2 CFR Part 200 for selecting a developer either via an RFP or an RFQ, which I think we're going to go over. But particularly if you were, say, using your capital funds, to follow the regulations in the capital fund rule in Section 905. And for those of you who are familiar with mixed finance development, Hope 6, or choice neighborhoods, again, there are special rules for procurement of a developer in the capital fund rule in Section 905. One of the advantages in, say, mixed finance or to selecting a developer before conversion is that once you select your developer, you no longer have to follow, your developer doesn't have to follow the federal procurement requirements. So that's a plus right there. But once the project is actually converted under RAD, then those federal procurement requirements would no longer apply. So that's sort of the short nuts and bolts of the procurement.
Right. And yeah, so one thing that's really important to remember, though, that there may not be federal rules that apply for your developer selection. For example, if you're doing RAD and you're using non-federal funds before closing, or you're doing Section 18 or Section 22. But you need to remember that even if there aren't federal procurement rules, there are undoubtedly state procurement rules. So you need to be sure that you're familiar with your state procurement rules and that your attorney is familiar with those state procurement rules, because they may apply some procedures that you have to follow that are not in the federal rules. And also, as a PHA, you probably have your own procurement policy. So your board will not be happy if you do a procurement that doesn't even follow your own procurement policy. So you'll want to make sure that you're familiar with that as well. You certainly can propose changes to your own procurement policy, but just be aware that it's not only a federal rule. There are also state rules and the PHA's own procurement policy.
So if you're thinking about the selection process and using an RFP or an RFQ, one of the things that you also want to think about is what is the basis that you're going to use to for a competition or for the evaluation or the scoring of those proposing to you. So if you're using an RFP because you have reasons to want to have people propose a very specific project, you're likely going to have scoring that relates to the merits of the proposed project. So you're going to see in your scoring, you should use in your scoring criteria or allocate points that relate to how well the proposal measures up against any goals or any expectations that you identified in your RFP. So there's going to be a lot of very specific project aspects. If you're doing an RFP and you've got a project, it also might talk about how much fee they're going to get or what risks they're willing to take on. So some of the things that we talked about earlier, you can weave into an RFP scoring criteria. In an RFP, you'd also want to include things like experience, capacity, things that reflect their likelihood of success working with you on the project or types of projects that you're going to engage with them on. You might also want to consider points related to what I'll call the mission category of things. And so this could be things like their commitment on past projects to projects that are heavy mission, or their experience with things like Section 3 or minority, emerging women, small businesses, or their commitment to using or achieving a certain percentage of contracts on your project that utilize MWESB types of businesses. So those are the types of things that you can put points to and evaluate your developer against. If you're using an RFQ, likely you're going to use a lot of those same scoring factors, just not the project-specific scoring factors. So if it's a qualification-based selection, you'll want to know you'll want to score them on their qualifications, their experience, the team that they're actually proposing to work with you. Maybe not the company at large. It might be a very large company that might have a national footprint, but you'd really want to understand who's going to work with you. You're on one hand you're working with the company, but on the other hand you're going to call a person at that company, and that's going to be your point of contact. So what's that person or what's that team's experience with your particular project? So drill down a little bit when you're thinking about the evaluation. It's a little bit more common for RFQs to be used than RFPs on these types of projects, and so just know that as well.
Hey, Mike, this is
I think we can move to the next slide because I think that many of the things Mike is speaking to are really on the next slide. There we go. Okay, so just want to point out that technically the difference between an RFP and RFQ, what Mike said is absolutely correct, but the technical difference in the HUD rules would be that the request for a proposal needs to request a price. There's a scope of work and you need to request a price. In a request for qualifications, price doesn't need to be requested or used as an evaluation factor. So those would apply if you're if you're operating under the federal rules. Remember, there are going to be lots of situations where you aren't operating under the federal rules, and it may be that you can structure this request as sort of a combination of an RFP and an RFQ. I would agree with Mike that the RFQ is the most common approach for conversion developments these days, and that many times PHAs will use an RFQ to qualify a group of developers, and then once they have that group sort of pre-qualified, then they'll select a particular developer based on the characteristics of a specific project. Is this a rehab, and this developer has lots of experience with rehab? Is it in-place rehab, which is sort of a very special person with very special abilities to work with residents, or is it new construction, et cetera? So, one of the beauties of RFQs, I think, is that, well, really, whether you technically make it an RFQ or an RFP, is to be extremely specific. That's kind of what Mike was saying. If you have MWBE requirements that you want to make, put it in the RFQ. If you have Section 3 requirements that you want to make sure are complied with, put it in the RFQ. If you want to be the property manager, put it in the RFQ. If you want them to provide the guarantees, all of them, put that in the RFQ. So you really want to, you need to have a strategy for the project, and then you want to make sure that there are no surprises from the developer's perspective, that you've said what business terms are important to you in the RFQ, and so it should be that only developers who are willing to comply with those will respond to your solicitation. So the better sense you have of what you want to do with the property, and the more specific you can be about that, the more you'll get proposals in which you're really able to compare apples to apples and kind of make the best decision for that particular development. There's a situation where people kind of tend to use RFPs, which is when they have really what is a market rate site and they're just not sure about what they should do with it. And sometimes people will put an RFP out just to kind of get an idea, get some ideas from the development community about what they might pursue.
Hey, Kathleen, just to really emphasize the point that if you're doing public housing mixed finance, or choice neighborhoods, you're following public housing procurement rules. But once you go through RAD, RAD doesn't establish any set procurement rules. You don't have to follow public housing procurement, and you're subject to whatever your state and local requirements that may be imposed. There may not be any. Just make sure that whatever practices you follow, that you have some board adopted standard that says here's what we're going to use for non-public housing procurement. And the same thing with Section 18. Once you get approved for Section 18 demolition disposition, and you decide after the demolition disposition that you're going to, say you temporarily turn it over to your nonprofit, and then you're going to look for a development partner, no one from HUD gets involved in how you procure that development partner. It's left the public housing program. So make sure you follow if there's any rules that are local, but make sure at that moment you're really doing good business practices.
Just one point on that, Greg's last point, that relates to timing. And so Greg said if you've gone through the Section 18 process and you've disposed of the project and it's now owned by a separate legal entity, that wouldn't trigger the HUD rules. If you're not spending your Section 9 money on it, that wouldn't trigger the HUD rules. But if you've done that, you may very well be pretty far down your development process path. If you've got an approved disposition and you've carried out the disposition, you're pretty deep into your project. And so bringing a developer in at that point means that you're inviting a developer into a project that's pretty well baked. And doing that might be fine, but you also might find that the developer steps in and says, oh, geez, I wish I would have been involved earlier because I'd really like to see things done this way, or it's in our collective best interest to do it this way. Did you think about that? So think about timing here as well. And so there's this kind of trade-off between the rules that you're going to be held to if you do it early, but there's some benefits of bringing them in early because you get the benefit of your developer's experience by having them involved early to help you think through what's the best way to do this. And the best way to do the project might be a shared thing between the developer and the housing authority. There might be a few things that I don't want to go as far as say that you're at odds with each other, but there's some tension there about shifting of risk or shifting of schedule, or do you sacrifice a little bit of schedule in the emphasis or in the interest of making things easier on residents, or so there's some tensions there that the housing authority and the developer might want to negotiate. But bringing the developer in earlier can help. Bringing them in later is not necessarily wrong, but there's trade-offs between the procurement rules that apply and when they step into your project and how baked that project is.
Thanks, Killa. So what are some of the decision points when negotiating development agreements with development partners?
So on developing a master developer agreement, this is an agreement between the PHA and the developer that really sets out all the major agreements related to the project between the two parties. And I think it's important that this is a document that covers all the major points up front, so there's no question later on about who does what, who is compensated for what approvals are needed, what the liabilities are, what are the penalties for non-performance, and even under what circumstances a development agreement should be terminated. So that's a comprehensive document that should be done up front once the developer is selected, and should be done so that there are no questions later on, or no one is moving forward without a clear picture of their responsibilities. Sometimes it's a push and pull between the parties, and sometimes it can take a long time. In choice neighborhoods, we now require a development agreement to be in place prior to or within 60 days of the award being made, which would be way in advance of when the developments would start. This way, you don't move forward on a piecemeal basis, and the PHA is not having to give in at the last moment to a developer demand just to keep the project moving and not slow things down. Some of the elements might be who's responsible for pre-development, demolition, infrastructure, financing, relocation, all the items I think we've already been discussing. Development agreement is the place where you lay out all these key elements and who's doing them, and where the PHA makes clear what its role is, what it has to approve before the developer can move forward, what the developer has to report on, and what the monitoring will be of the project. We have had projects seriously delayed because of a lack of agreement on any of the points, including particularly the developer fee and what it will be and how it will be shared. If PHA needs assistance from legal or other consultants, it's good to get that assistance up front when negotiating an agreement.
Okay, and I would totally agree that the master developer agreements are really important, particularly for large phased projects, which would be, like the choice neighborhood projects, like the old HUD 6 project. But I also have seen them take an incredibly long period of time to negotiate. Meanwhile, no one's applying for tax credits and the project's not moving forward. So I would say, and this is just an area where Lucy and I probably have a different perspective. I would say that with a specific, if what you're doing your procurement for is for a specific project, I would use, or if you think you might use a different developer for each segment of a project, I sort of lean towards project-specific developer agreements, because I think once people are to the point where they understand how the financing is going to go, it's easier to negotiate some of the business points because everybody has better and more equal information. But, again, on a phased project, it may well, and where you're going to stick with the same developer, or at least that's your intention, then the master developer agreement probably makes more sense. And then to follow up on what Lucy was saying, I would say the very first thing you want to do when talking about decision points is you want to, and getting a development agreement, is to hire an attorney with experience in that type of transaction. So a general real estate attorney will be fine for title work, for pilot agreements, and local law opinions, but you really need someone with extensive experience if what you're going to do is RAD or a Section 18, rebuild, a LIHTC deal, FHA financing. You don't want your attorney to be learning on your bill. So you really want to make sure you pick somebody with a lot of experience, and you also want to check references. Be sure to call your peer agencies and see how satisfied they were with their legal representation. And then in terms of the agreement itself, I would just recall Mike's discussion of the risks and rewards. I would agree with Lucy that the biggest issue tends to be fees, and so it's important that you, as a housing authority, have a realistic expectation about fees. I mean, your fees should be directly related to the amount of risk you're taking in the deal. And also, please be sure you understand what the limitations are in each of the programs on developer fee. And in the full deck that we'll distribute later on this week or early next week, there's a separate slide that gives you the appropriate citations for all the different regulations that the different programs have on developer fee. So it's good to come to that negotiating table with a clear understanding of what fees are going to be allowed, and then a realistic expectation of how much you're going to get based on the level of risk you're willing to take. Also key is being sure to include what you want the role of the PHA to be in property management, and then to be sure always that you keep the land lease and that you ask for a right of first refusal. That's it from my standpoint.
Hey, Kathleen and Lucy, Greg again. I wonder whether the sort of the difficulty in getting to some agreement with a developer, negotiating that, whether the amount of homework a PHA does early on figuring out its strategy. What am I doing with this project? And what is the role that I'm going to play versus developer? And making that as clear as possible by the time you do the solicitation should then expedite things down the road. You know what you want to do. You know what the role you're looking for the developer, so it should be less room for sort of doubt or negotiation. But I also wonder if notwithstanding all the wonderful work that's been done by PHAs and development partners in the mixed finance program over the years with the Hope 6 program, it's also true though that for any repositioning where you're converting to Section 8, the financing is simpler, right? That your developers and all that don't have to learn about the Public Housing Operating Fund program and how that's going to contribute to the transaction and how much of the operating fund slug is this project going to get. No, it's all based on Section 8 contract rents, and I bet that's also helps simplify things and expedites the various negotiations because at least the development community better understands the model.
I think, Greg, that you make a good point. I think that there's the Section 8 platform is certainly well understood by the development community, by lenders, investors, so they don't have to try to understand something that is less common, and so that certainly helps. And I think identifying what you want in your RFP, or even before you publish the RFP, is really important. Or RFQ. I mean, you can also identify what your project is in the RFQ that you're asking someone to propose their qualifications on. And if you have these must-haves, and Kathleen was saying this before, if you know that you're going to be the operator, or if you know that whatever your must-have is about this project, if you have one, say it. Be clear about it. And if it's about you must get a share of the developer fee, say that. If it's that you must take care of this fix in the building, if it's you must have a green roof, or you must complete this structural improvement, or whatever it might be, whatever you know that you've got, be clear about that early, so that you make those negotiations of your development agreement go a bit smoother. I think there's also a point I want to reemphasize the importance of paying attention to your project the whole way through, and understanding how these agreements behave with each other. If you do a RAD or Section 18 debt tax credit project, there's going to be a lot of agreements. and it's important to understand how they all work together. So follow the agreements and follow the money. Understand who has what exposure and understand what exposure you have. So if you think that you're going to get 20% of the developer fee, make sure that you follow that all the way through the documents and you're aware of whether your share of the fee has been put at risk by anyone. You may want to do that, and that might be a fair thing to agree to. You might say to your developer partner, hey, it's only your 80% of the fee that's at risk. My fee gets paid no matter what. So knowing that all of the agreements that will get signed say what you think is your role in the deal and what you're going to get is really important. This goes to Kathleen's point about having a good lawyer involved. It also, there's a bit of the business side of the deal as much as the legal side of the deal that you really need to understand about how all these pieces go together. It involves budgets, schedules, program, risk, how all of those pieces fit together. And the repositioning is a piece of that, but your tax credit investors agreements, your state tax credit agreements, your bond or debt documents will all have threads of this running through them.
Okay, I know resident relocation, you touched upon it a little bit earlier, and it's the topic in and of itself, but can you speak to the role of developer partner in relocation?
So obviously, it's really a critical item. It's the first thing, in my experience, when you raise the redevelopment to residents, it's the first thing they want to know is when I'm going to be moved. So it's very critical, and it can take a long time to happen. Not only you're required to follow the appropriate rules for relocation, but also depends on whether you have anywhere to move your residents to. And in tight housing markets, that can be a problem and can definitely slow down the project. In my experience, we have had projects where the PHA is entirely responsible for relocation. And oftentimes that works best because the PHA, they know their residents, they know their location, they know probably who the other partners are out there that can help, they know where landlords are, and that generally has worked very well. But we have had times where developers are responsible for the relocation, but that generally is with developers who have an arm of their business that deals with relocation or deals with resident services. The Michaels company, nationwide developer, has an arm of their agency that works with residents. We have others, McCormick Barrett Salazar, that has a very well-known now nationwide arm of their business that deals with resident services. There are also developers who will hire themselves relocation specialists, and there are consultants out there that focus on relocation, federal relocation requirements, or just relocation in general, and those have worked well also. So it probably depends on whether the PHA is really familiar and has done relocation before, who your developer is, and then who do you feel comfortable, if neither have in-house experience, actual partner with a consultant. And I think with my experience, PHAs have done a really good job on relocation, at least for my projects. But it can take time, and you need to start early and often reach out often to residents and keep them informed of what's going on, so that there are no surprises and nothing that will hold your redevelopment.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Lucy said about the housing authorities wanting to stay involved with residents. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't rely upon your developer or maybe even bring in a relocation-specific consultant. But the engagement with residents are one of the areas of a project where the probability of getting a lot of energy focused on the housing authority is great. And if residents are concerned or getting organized, and that can have a big impact on your development. So staying involved with your residents is pretty key. At the end of the day, even if you're hired a developer, the housing authority is still the landlord. So you've got the lease agreement with your resident, and you're telling the resident that you're going to make a change in the building that they live in. And so you've got this responsibility whether you've asked the developer to perform relocation tasks or not. So staying close to the residents, don't leave any communication voids. If you leave a void in communication, it's going to get filled with a narrative that might not be your narrative. So make sure that you're giving them good information and staying involved. And if you need to bring in people to actually execute the move or to write the notice, that's a good approach. But I'd encourage you to stay close to your residents because it's such an important piece of the success of a project.
And I would just add that keep in touch with your residents, not just up until you move them, but throughout, because hopefully they're coming back. And to be successful when they're moved and be able to come back to your new development successfully.
Great, and if the PHA does decide that they want to do the relocation themselves, make sure that your relocation department understands that URA relocation and or RAD URA relocation are not the same as what the PHA typically does when residents are moved from one public housing complex to the next. So they really need to have an in-depth knowledge of the rules, which for RAD, looking at the Fair Housing and Relocation Notice, Section 18 and Section 22 have their own relocation provisions that are similar to, but not identical to, the Uniform Relocation Act. So if you do have a relocation department and you want to use them for your relocation for a big development, there are lots of reasons why that's a good idea. Just make sure that your people who are in charge of that relocation understand that the rules are very different from the normal rules for moving residents from one public housing complex to the next.
One last point that relates to the risks and benefit and residents. Lucy had brought up return. And return might mean physically moving back into the building. Return may also mean something like you just signing a new lease with a resident who's in their unit. The act of a resident moving back into a unit or signing a new lease on a tax credit project is a very important step. And it goes to the promises that will be made to your investor around credit delivery, which goes to then whether the investor is going to pay you all the equity that they had signed up for. So if the housing authority is going to take on the relocation and the return, the lease up of the building and the credit delivery is a really important thing to focus on. So you want to make sure that what you're thinking about for refilling that building is consistent with what the investor's been promised for the building being leased up. If those two things don't align, there's a financial exposure that might come back to the housing authority. So it's really important to make sure that your resident return, your lease up, your credit delivery, and who's responsible for any credit adjusters are all aligned.
Yeah. I would add just one. Oh, go ahead.
Just real quickly, this is Kathy from the SAC. I just wanted to quickly chime into what resident relocation can mean. It can, under Section 18 and 22, it often means an initial offer of some form of comparable housing, which could include things like an existing, even offering families their existing public housing unit, and then it is the PHA's responsibility to usually take on that role, the initial comparable housing. and they can't even complete the disposition until they make that offer and complete relocation for Section 18 and 22 purposes. And then later on, after those units are moved maybe to a Section 18 platform or are in the process of getting moved to a Section 18 platform, there could be negotiations with having the developer do physical relocation or something like that.
And then I would just add from a lesson that we learned in Charlotte that we think was incredibly obvious, but we didn't focus on it on the first couple of Hope 6 relocations, which is whoever does the relocation, be sure that you as the PHA are in contact with the school system and with social service providers and any other educational partners so that they are not surprised when the time comes to actually move one of their clients. So really important for consistent service delivery to residents and for kids in schools that you've done some planning with the school district and social service providers, regardless of whether you're actually going to do the relocation or you're going to hire somebody or the developer's going to do it. You're the one with the contact in the community.
Hey, I just want to jump to, we got a good question from the audience before we jump to any other issues. You can move on to 8, Kayla. And I'll summarize the question. And I think everyone on the panel here can really address this. But so when a PHA is working with the developer that isn't working within the confines of the master development agreement, what can the PHA do to sort of bring them back in line or bring in another developer? And I'm assuming this question means that they're not only the developer, but they're also the management agent at the house, at the property. So, what are the remedies for a PHA for a non-performing developer, and what is HUD's role in helping the PHA with that issue?
Well, I can speak just from experience with that. If things have reached the point where the developer is not performing, and it's clear they're not performing, and there's no road forward, there should be a determined way in advance, hopefully, to terminate the developer and to part ways. Hopefully amicably, and then for the PHA to reach out with another RFP or RFQ if necessary and procure another developer. So that would be the worst possible solution probably, but the way to handle it. And as far as HUD's involvement, I think it would depend on the program. In choice neighborhoods, you would need HUD approval to do that, but if it was, if the project had converted under RAD, I'm not sure what the role of the RAD office would be in that particular position, but you would want to be sure that the expertise of the old developer was replaced similarly with the expertise of the new developer.
Yeah, I would, it may be too late in the specific example, but I would say I would just repeat the advice that I got on my very first development deal coming out of college, and that was follow the money. So developers develop partly because of mission, but also because they, need to make money to be able to pay their staff, et cetera. So as you're setting up a developer agreement, be sure you create deadlines by which certain things have to be done and make the payment of that percentage of the fee, contingent on that deadline or that particular set of actions being done. So that's the easiest way to resolve those disputes typically, but you need to have a little bit of advanced planning to to see in the future and anticipate that those kinds of issues might happen. You know, if the relationship has really fallen apart, then yeah, then I'm not sure that, and you haven't set up any milestones that relate to payment, then there may not be a way to resolve it amicably, and you may be doing what Lucy described, which is, you know, dissolving the relationship and procuring somebody new.
And I guess I'll put my HUD hat back on to respond to what is HUD's role. I mean, to the extent that this is impacting the management of the property, HUD's going to look at the housing authority. They're going to turn to the housing authority for, you know, H2S deficiencies and things like that at the property. So it really is incumbent upon the housing authority and the developer to work through this.
Yeah, just add to that really the Kathleen's comment about follow the money is this notion of follow the agreements, and so it's within the agreements that everyone's expectations will be defined and what their obligations are, and if they're in, what default looks like, and what ways to cure default are. HUD's contracts are going to be with the housing authority. If it's a mixed finance deal, it's going to be, you know, it's going to be largely with the housing authority. It'll be declaration of trust with the land, but the agreements that are actionable are largely with the housing authority, and then the housing authority will have agreements with the developer or the ownership entity. So you need to look to those agreements to see what rights does the housing authority have to enforce whatever the issue is. You know, so it depends on exactly what the nature of the issue is. You need to look to the right agreement. So is it an HQS issue? Is it a not collecting rent? Is it, you know, what is the right, what's the problem exactly? See where that lives in your agreements, and then see what you can do about enforcing that.
Okay, so then I guess we're going to sort of a more free session in our remaining few minutes here and see if we have any questions from the audience. But is there anything, Mike, Kathleen, Kathy, Greg, Jane, Lucy, that you wanted to touch upon that we didn't get through in the formal presentation?
Yeah, I made myself a list of 3 things. First, in working with a developer partner, come from a position of strength. Educate yourself, know the key business points, and where you can be flexible. Use the development consultant if needed. Number 2 was understand what the developer needs. They need information, they need prompt payment, they need smooth processing of construction drawings, they need timely decisions when plans change. And then the third is that the relationship with the developer needs to be open and transparent. Don't try to hide key information because you feel like that will improve your negotiating position. Share the RAD resource desk. Have them join in on HUD calls. Make sure everyone understands things that impact the schedule. Don't fall back on saying, oh, we'd like to do that, but HUD says we can't, if you haven't really explored all the options. So really, if you're going to have a development partner, make them your partner and keep the relationship open and hopefully, you know, build trust based on that relationship. So those were my takeaways.
I would agree absolutely with what Kathleen said, that I would always focus on this being a partnership between you, the developer, and HUD to an extent, and everyone working together well. But I'd also encourage PHAs to don't just sit back and let your developer and your consultants run your project. Be an active participant, no matter what your ultimate role is. Be a participant, be conscious of what's going on, and making sure that the project is moving forward in the way that you want it to move forward, because it is your project, it is your residence, and in the end, it's ultimately you know, the face of your housing authority.
and I'd agree with all those points. And one thing to add, two things to add about picking a developer partner. This is going to be a partner that you're going to be with for a long time, and that, you know, best case scenario, your project goes wonderfully and there's no issues, and it moves to a successful outcome. There's also, we know from experience, even very experienced teams will have projects that run into problems. If you experience a problem, what's your partner going to be like to solve that problem with? And so do you feel like you've got a partner that has kind of an agreement in principle and has shared principles and shared values and approaches the project in the same way, that they understand what's important to the housing authority, you understand what's important to them, and is it someone you feel like that you can problem solve with if things go sideways? So ask yourself those questions. You know, what's this partner going to be like to work with when you're choosing them? With respect to being your own developer, so if you're thinking about self-developing, that is a big decision. So I want to go back to that point that was made earlier. There's a lot of great housing authorities around the country that are self-developers. And there's a lot of great housing authorities that aren't self-developers but still do great work. So you don't necessarily need to be a developer to do good work serving low-income people through your real estate. You can do pieces of it. You can rely upon external partners. So figure out what's right for you, and it needs to be part of a bigger organizational strategy. It shouldn't be about a particular project, and maybe even shouldn't be about just repositioning. If you're going to invest in the apparatus of being a developer, there's a lot of fixed transaction costs or organizational costs that go into that. And so what is your development agenda even beyond repositioning? So think about that as you think about, is this the right thing for us to invest in?
Okay, thanks everybody. Dan, if it's okay, I think there's a few questions from the audience that we can hit on.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. So sort of similar to the question earlier about templates, had two questions come in actually about if there's a sample master developer agreement or agreement templates, or if not provided by HUD, if you have any suggestions about where you could find one.
Our office does not have a template, but we encourage, again, to have PHAs reach out to other PHAs that have done similar development, and I'm sure they're more than happy to share, or they may just be posted. It could be posted on a website, but reach out, and I'm sure that the others would share.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So next question is, can a PHA work from a pre-qualified pool of developers?
I've seen that happen in projects, in HUD 6 or Choice Neighborhoods projects. There has been a pre-qualified group of developers that could be selected on for various phases or aspects of a project. I don't want to speak for the RAD folks, but that would be acceptable to our programs.
Yeah, so again, remember in RAD, we don't establish any procurement rules per se. So the PHA feels that coming up with a pre-qualified list is the approach they want to take. They feel that's appropriate. It's perfectly acceptable to us.
All right. So next question is also for the RAD office, but others can chime in. If your RAD conversion generates a profit for the housing authority, what can be done with those funds?
As long as you can spend it in accordance with whatever your mission is. developer fee and cash flow is not restricted in any way through any RAD conversion. So it's only whatever requirements might be imposed locally upon you as a PHA. Mostly just use it to support your mission.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I got a few questions about if this session is being recorded. It is being recorded and will be posted on HUD Exchange in the coming weeks. And also, as Dan mentioned early on, there'll be an accompanying sort of larger PowerPoint that'll go out to all attendees with more detailed information when that recording is posted as well. And it will be shared via email to everyone who attended, with everyone who attended. And I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So last call, remember you can either type your question in the chat box or raise your hand to ask it verbally. It looks like we have one hand raised. So Charlene, I'm going to unmute your line for you to ask your question. Charlene?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question, I wanted to tell you, this was so, you need a part 2 of this webinar, and even I'm willing to pay for it, like $79 or $200, because this was so helpful, especially I am a commissioner, and a lot of things, you know, you don't know until you get on, and about the developers and all of that, especially the procurement part of it. Like, for instance, if a procurement had a negotiation with the old CEO, and when the new CEO came, something was differently, and the contract is totally terminated, and the vendor still wants to pursue it, but it's been terminated, and it seems like it's been terminated correctly. It's just that the appearance of it didn't seem correct. So how does the PH or the commissioners even think about that type to avoid it? Thank you.
Any thoughts on that?
I may need that question repeated.
But I'm not going to say everything because it was kind of lengthy what I was saying, and time is of the essence. But what the main point is, if a contract seems like honored with the old CEO, but when the new CEO takes place, and the CEO terminates the contract due to further investigation of the contract, but the vendor seems to have the appearance. I mean, the vendor seems to have the impression that it was unfavorably terminated.
Hey, Dan, I might try to answer this, Greg. So, you know, contracts don't expire or just run with an executive director, right? So that's why boards, when they approve contracts or when they give procurement authority to executive directors, the director leaves, that contract's still binding. You know, sometimes a board may feel like there's a need for a change in leadership, or maybe a PHA director leaves, but whatever that director leaves behind, you still have to honor. So if you're in a situation where you're a board now and you've got a contract and you were somehow thought that maybe you'd be able to terminate that contract with whatever developer partner you have, really to have a close conversation with your attorney and very likely rope in your field office for some advice, because that's it's a pretty dicey area.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So back to the earlier question about profits from a RAD project. Can they be reinvested into more housing authority staff to increase staff capacity to aid in continuing further RAD projects?
Absolutely. You can, if that's what your board decides that they want to do, is it's appropriate to that the wage rates aren't competitive for what you're paying your staff, or that they're not. You want to provide bonuses that are sort of in keeping with prevailing practices in the community, without doubt. So board, you always have to make sure that your stuff is reasonable, but yeah, whatever, if it meets your mission and it's reasonable, then it's permissible.
Okay, thanks. So next one, you mentioned that after procuring a developer partner, the developer does not have to utilize procurement protocols moving forward for contractors and such. If the PHA is serving as a developer, will they still have to utilize procurement protocols for contractors, et cetera?
Yes, it will.
And that's, as Lucy is defining it, that's, yeah, if you're doing mixed finance public housing. But it's a different issue if you're doing repositioning through RAD or Section 18. But without doubt, if a PHA is its own self-developer under a mixed finance project, it still has to follow procurement rules when it selects subcontractors and things like that.
Okay, thanks. Lucy, we also got a question about, I think at one point you mentioned a few sort of bigger name developers, and got a question about if you're able to repeat those to the audience.
Yes. I'm not repeating them as an advertisement, but using them as example. It was the Michaels organization and McCormick, Baron, Salazar in reference. I was using them in terms of them having a resident focus within their organization.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So that's the last question that I'm seeing. Let me just scroll down one more time and make sure no one has their hand up. Okay, I think that's everything. So I just want to remind everyone to do the survey when it pops up, and I'll pass it over to Dan for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Kayla. Thanks to all our presenters. It's a great job, and hope that everybody in the audience got something out of this. And again, please fill out your survey and let us know what else you'd like to hear. We don't have any webinars on the agenda for the coming months, but I'm sure we'll get something posted to the HUD Exchange soon. Thanks so much.